Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Current, the North Central Region Water Network's Speed Networking webinar series. The network is a university extension-led collaboration among 12 land-grant universities in the Upper Midwest. My name is Rebecca Power, and I will be your moderator for the day. Our topic this afternoon is evaluating outreach programs, topics, and trends. And before we introduce our presenters, just want to provide a few notes to participants about the way these sessions work. If you have questions for our presenters, you can submit them in the chat box. And the chat box is accessible in the purple Collaborate panel in the lower right-hand corner of the webinar screen. There's a little purple tab there that you can click on to access the chat box. There will be a dedicated question and answer session following the last presentation. So we have two presenters today, and after they're done, well, we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion. If you need a phone-in option, you can access that by opening the session menu in the upper left and selecting use your phone for audio if you're having audio issues. And finally, this session will be recorded and available at northcentralwater.org and also with e-extension at learn.extension.org. Okay, so now on to our presenters. Today we have Amber Saylor-Mace, who is at the University of Wisconsin Extension, and she is also our North Central Region Water Network Evaluation Specialist. She is going to be talking about evaluating Wisconsin's runoff risk advisory forecast, and which is a decision support tool for manure application. Scott Chaston at the University of Minnesota Extension, who also has done some great evaluation work with the North Central Region Water Network and in many other areas as well, is going to be talking about documenting the impacts of collaborative efforts and a specific evaluation method, ripple effects mapping. So on to our presenters, and you can just take a minute here to read Amber's experience. She's here with us in Wisconsin's Environmental Resources Center and has a great evaluation and social science background that she brings to natural resource management. And we'll, without further ado, Amber, looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks to Rebecca for organizing this evaluation-focused session of the current webinar series. And definitely thanks to Scott for saying yes to also presenting today. I don't know if I can advance the slides. Oh, I can. Cool. I was waiting for my name to move up. Today I'm going to present on kind of a case study of how evaluation has been incorporated into one decision support tool for agriculture called the Runoff Risk Advisory Forecast. And so a short outline of my talk today. First, I'll sort of look back at some of the background on why the tool was developed, some initial evaluation efforts, including some surveys and one focus group that I conducted. Then moving on to kind of the present, what I'm working on now. The North American Manure Expo happened this past summer, and we're doing some follow-up surveys with attendees of that event because they're relevant potential users of the tool. And then just briefly, I'll talk about a little bit about the future. We'll do some additional usability testing likely with the new version, and also how it's expanding across the Great Lakes region. So here is a screenshot of the tool. Just give a little bit of background on where it came from. In Wisconsin, it was initiated by some legislative action in 2006. There were a few fish kills that happened that were a result of manure runoff. And so the legislature kind of tasked the Department of Ag, Trade, Consumer Protection, or DATCP, to come up with kind of a non-regulatory decision support tool that would help manure applicators and farmers who are applying manure to make better or more informed decisions, at least in terms of expected runoff. So is there going to be a big rainstorm in a couple days and the manure won't have a time to incorporate into the soil and is more likely to be washed away. Or in this case, like the example map I show from last week, if there's frozen ground or is there snow that's melting, those kind of issues. And then the evaluation or social science component got started in 2016. Oh, and I guess one more thing I wanted to say about this screenshot. This is the current tool in Wisconsin that's available for the public to use, and it does have larger watershed basins that you can see outlined there. Whereas the updated version, which should be going live this spring, hopefully, has a finer scale, which is a little bit hard to see on this particular day, but it does have a 4-kilometer grid. So a farmer or hauler could zoom in more and get a more detailed look at what the runoff risk is for their area where they're applying manure. And then this version of the tool also added some additional data layers. So there are tabs behind. The runoff risk is still the most important one, so we show it first. But then if they're interested, they can look at a mapped version of the modeled precipitation, soil temperature, soil saturation. And then we also added this slider so they can kind of move the dates forward if they're thinking about the future. Oh, and then one more thing about the tool before I move on. Historically, the tool has had kind of an archive or wayback machine, as one of the collaborators calls it. So a hauler or a farmer could put in a date in the past when maybe they had looked at it and saw that it was clear and they decided to apply manure. They can look back and say, and sort of confirm that and use it kind of as an insurance policy, maybe when they're feeling pressure or maybe getting pushback about having applied manure at a particular time. So thinking about the evaluation components, the Professional Nutrient Applicators Association of Wisconsin, or PNAW, they do an annual training in the wintertime for mainly manure haulers and then particularly CAFO farmers. So in January of 2017, we had a presentation. Our colleagues at the Department of Ag gave a presentation on this tool and started talking about the potential updates and answered some questions. About 60 people were in the audience, and they were a mix of haulers and farmers. And we did distribute a short one-page survey to sort of get their perspectives, since they are one intended audience of this tool in Wisconsin. And then we also planned a focus group with 8 haulers and CAFO dairy farmers that we got in touch with ahead of time, so they could sort of stay after the presentation and the training was over. So some initial results from that survey of everyone who was in the audience and kind of heard about the tool. Before the presentation, 59% had already heard of the RRAF, 37% had actually looked at the website, and 32% had used the tool to help make manure spreading decisions. And while these numbers may seem low, I thought they were pretty impressive, given some of the other decision support tool projects I've worked on. And I'll touch on some of why I think that is a little later. And then we also asked at least one open-ended question on that survey, kind of if you did use the tool, talk a little bit about how you use it or why you use it. So just a couple comments that I will read. It's easy to use to determine spreading decisions, aka which farm is first. It's mostly accurate, but when we're pinched on time, we don't go by it 100%. And then kind of on the flip side, we don't haul if the advisory is high. So kind of some variation in how people were using the tool at that time. And then we kind of asked following the presentation, so even if they hadn't heard of it before, now they should have, hopefully a better understanding of what this tool could do for them. 85% said it provides useful information for their work. 65% were likely or very likely to use this tool in the next year. And 84% said they'll tell other haulers or farmers about this tool. So then after sort of the educational session was over, we had invited a bunch of professional haulers and CAFO dairy farmers from across the state of Wisconsin to participate in a focus group to get into more detail on how they've used the tool, perspectives on where it was going moving forward. So this map just shows all the pins are basically everyone we invited from across the state. And we wanted to get kind of a geographic spread so we weren't just capturing perspectives from one area of the state that might have a different context. And then the gold stars are those people who actually showed up. So for the focus group, we started off kind of asking them what factors play the biggest role when they're deciding where and when to spread manure. And the first thing they said was weather, and they talked about that for a little bit. But then the second most common thing that they were talking about was public perception. And then this sort of launched into a lot of commiseration about environmentalists or other outsiders who were kind of against them. And they talked a lot about basically things that point to them being under intense public scrutiny. People taking pictures of them, saying they're the most photographed guy on the farm. And then also talking about what they felt were unsubstantiated complaints against their operation in the case of a CAFO farmer. Then local municipalities passing restrictions on what they can do that basically were making their job harder, but in ways that they felt weren't necessarily improving things from an environmental standpoint. And then just overall that the general public doesn't understand agriculture today. So I think all of those kind of point to their perspective on why they would be highly motivated, I guess, to use this tool. Then at that point in the focus group, we kind of showed them more details on the potential updates on the tool, the finer scale, the gridded map, additional data layers that we could potentially present, and then also just kind of ask them how could the tool be improved. They definitely had strong interest in this finer scale gridded forecast, and they saw it as an improvement over the watershed basins, which they felt were too generalized. And they also sort of emphasized that it was important to have the forecast out early in the day, just because they tend to do a lot of their planning for the day very early. So I think at that point, the forecast was coming out at like 9 or 10 a.m. So that was a little late for them. And then also just reiterating that they wanted to be able to go back to the maps after the fact. So continuing to have that archive was definitely important to them. We specifically asked them about the types of data they would like to see beyond just the runoff risk. And they talked about evapotranspiration rates, percent humidity, soil moisture and saturation, and soil temperature. We also had a discussion on if they would like to be alerted via an email or a text message when the risk gets to a certain threshold or when it's high. And there was some interest from some people, but overall they were kind of already in the habit of checking the forecast. And I just have a note there that they may be outliers because they did seem to, all of them had used the tool for a while, and a few of them said they'd been using it for years, so they were maybe more invested in using that tool. And then they also talked about a mobile-friendly version, or just the website being mobile-friendly is important because they like to be able to look at the map in the field. Generally, they're planning at their computer, so that's fine, but they tend to use a smartphone if a customer is calling them and saying, hey, I need you to come haul over on my farm. Or if they see, dark clouds rolling in, they want to be able to look at it on their phone. Then kind of moving on to what I've been working on more recently, the North American Manure Expo came to Arlington, Wisconsin this past summer in August 2017. And that's been going on since about 2001, I think, or at least 2001. And it rotates locations around the Midwest. And it's generally an opportunity for training, demonstrations. People can look at new equipment and technology and just kind of get up to speed on all the advancements in manure. And we did send out a follow-up survey to about 435 attendees. And the primary purpose of the survey was to sort of evaluate the Manure Expo. But we were able to include some questions on the runoff risk advisory forecast for those people who are in Wisconsin. But when I see the graphic got messed up, but the subset who live and work in Wisconsin is about 114 people so far that have responded. So then just sort of what role people are playing who attended the Manure Expo and then answered the follow-up survey. About 22% were livestock farmers, 21% were certified crop advisors or consultants, and then the other most common choice was other, and quite a few people wrote in equipment dealer, or conservation district employees, academia, obviously. So then the subset who, lived and worked in Wisconsin, we asked them a few questions about the RIF. Had they heard about it before the survey? 68% said yes. So that was even a little bit higher than at the PNAW training in 2017. Had they visited the website before? And we give them kind of a screenshot, so to sort of refresh memories. And 47% said, no, I've never visited that website. 41% said yes, at least a few times. And then a smaller proportion were visiting it once a month, weekly, up to a few times a week. Next, we asked if they had ever used it to help make manure spreading decisions, kind of similar to that PNAW survey. 31% said yes, 27% said no, I haven't used it to make decisions, and 42% said not applicable, I do not make spreading decisions. So this was just a case where we thought it was important to break out the no's. So we know that it's not that 70% of people who are making manure decisions aren't using this tool. It's just sort of that 27% that we have to chip away at, perhaps. Then of those who had used it at least once to make manure spreading decisions, we asked how often they were using it. The most common response was 41% saying they use it occasionally, and then a pretty even split at 29% each for regularly and once or twice a season. And then we had some open-ended questions where we wanted to understand a little more about why people are or are not using this tool to help with their decision making. So I'll just read a couple quotes. In terms of positives, one person said, I consult farmers on nutrient management, so using the site as a source of weather conditions is very important. Or I refer to it occasionally, but my CAFO clients use it all the time. In bad weather, I like to see how high the risk is before we shut down. We do not want to run into a manure runoff situation due to rain, and we apply a lot on the hills, and at the bottom is always a dam creek. And then a few comments on why they currently don't use the tool. One person said, I make decisions about spreading manure on my farm based on soil conditions and the weather forecast. A model that uses those isn't helpful. So this kind of points to an opportunity to communicate more about what this tool does, because it's not as simple as soil conditions and the weather forecast. And then a couple comments like we aren't usually near water. I have common sense, and that I don't spread in the winter. So seeming to imply they don't need to use the tool in that case. Then we kind of asked them to look to the future in the next year. How likely are they to use the tool? We had a pretty even split there. About 30% were undecided, 41% were likely, and 29% were thinking they were unlikely to use it over the next year. And then just a couple quick points on kind of the future next steps of this project. The regional runoff team met for the first time in 2017 in the winter, and just recently met again in 2018, last month. So now Michigan, Ohio, and Minnesota also have a version of the runoff risk advisory forecast, and they've kind of tailored them to their specific needs, as well as like capacity or what tools they have to sort of build the website. And we did talk at this meeting about expanding or marketing kind of beyond manure, because while that is the focus in Wisconsin for sure, it's not necessarily the key issue in all of these states. And also just thinking about maximizing the utility of the tool, it could also be relevant for pesticide application, for example. And then just touching on another project that I'm helping to evaluate, the Natural Resource Conservation Service has funded a conservation innovation grant to develop manure hauler and applicator training, and it'll be kind of an online curriculum. And Kevin Erb is leading that process up from Wisconsin, and then we also have partners in North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Michigan. And so we have talked about having the Wisconsin-specific training include the runoff risk advisory forecast to cover the Wisconsin tool, and then probably also in Michigan now that we touched base on that. Oh, and then I just wanted to quickly touch on how interagency and interdisciplinary this project has been, which has been really cool to see. So we do have like National National Weather Service hydrologists, the Department of Soil Science at UW-Madison, of course our ERC evaluation unit, the DNR, DATCAP, Discovery Farms, and then of course if we think about the other states that are starting to join up, it's even broader than that. So yeah, that's all I have for today, and I did include the link to the website if people want to check it out.
Great, thank you so much, Amber. And again, just a reminder for folks that have questions, there's a purple tab in the lower right-hand corner of your screen that if it's not already opened up, if you do open it up, it will give you a little balloon symbol that is where the chat box is. So you can submit your questions for our presenters in the chat box, and we will get to them at the end of the session. Okay, so our next presenter is Scott Chasden, an evaluation and research specialist for the Center of Community Vitality at the University of Minnesota Extension. I'll just give you a minute to scan his bio there, and after that we will go ahead and get to Scott's presentation. Thank you, Scott, so much. Great to have you.
Well, thanks, Rebecca. And so I'm going to go in a rather different direction from what the presentation that Amber just gave, and talk a little bit about an evaluation method that can be broadly applied. I shouldn't use that application metaphor because that was about manure a few moments ago, but we can talk about this method. Ripple effects mapping can be useful for any engaged or collaborative effort that you may be involved in. So thinking in particular about efforts to engage perhaps landowners or groups that you may have engagement with over an extended period of time, and where relationships are likely to be strengthened. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ripple effects mapping, and this is a 15-minute overview, but I'll be giving you some resources if you want to go deeper and learn more about ripple effects mapping. So the purpose of, well, first of all, the definition, which I did not put on a slide, is ripple effects mapping is a method for conducting impact evaluation that engages program and community stakeholders to retrospectively and visually map the chain of effects resulting from a program or complex collaboration. So the idea here is this is very much of a qualitative method, and the idea is to better understand both intended and unintended results of a program or collaborative. And you can conduct ripple mapping, which is a group activity, either after a program has been completed, perhaps a year or so after completion, and that's more of a summative evaluation use, or you can use a more developmental evaluation approach and conduct the ripple mapping sort of mid-program and perhaps revisit your ripple map after the program is complete. One thing I like to emphasize is that ripple mapping is not recommended as the only evaluation tool used for a program. You would likely want to have other methods that are used to measure specific outcomes for participants in a program, but ripple mapping does get you some of this interesting impact information about the effects of the program beyond those direct participants. So I like to talk a little bit about social capital. Social capital is, you know, a social science concept, obviously. It means the norms and networks that enable people to act collectively. And ripple mapping is a nice tool for looking at the so what, the what happens as a result of strengthened social capital. People do not act in isolation. They work together on a lot of collaborative, in collaboration, and as a result of that, positive things can happen. A colleague of mine has a quote that change flows along the lines of relationships. So ripple mapping allows you to document those changes that occur. Sometimes those changes are intended as part of your program theory or in your logic model. Sometimes they're not intended, but it's still important to capture them and document them. So last fall, several co-authors and I edited a book called A Field Guide to Ripple Effects Mapping. You can't really click on the link, but there's an easy link there. Then maybe someone could put it in the chat to have a more easy access to the link. But we created this field resource that is free and downloadable on the internet. And one of the chapters of the book is one I really led the writing of, is a literature review where we identify these 4 core ingredients of ripple mapping. And I'd like to mention them just briefly. The first one is appreciative inquiry, which many of you may be familiar with. It's really more of a facilitation tool, but it's defined as the cooperative search for the best in people, their organizations, and the world around them. And it's this idea that engaging people to talk about those best qualities of a program is a very great way to start a conversation that produces a lot of interesting insight about what a program or intervention did lead to. And I'm going to come back and talk about this a little further later, but it doesn't, appreciative inquiry is how you start a ripple mapping session, but there is an important role for what I call the negative discussion later in a ripple mapping session, where you talk with participants about things that have happened that have not been so good. So that is not excluded, but it's just not very generative to start with that negative stuff. Ripple mapping also uses a participatory approach where the evaluator engages not just the people who run the program, but also a broad range of community stakeholders throughout the evaluation. There's a process of interviewing in ripple mapping where people are paired up to interview each other using these appreciative inquiry questions. And then there's a whole group discussion component that happens later in the 2-hour session. And ripple mapping uses mind mapping software to actually document and capture the conversation and show, using this mind mapping tool, this chain of effects that comes from a program. Just to briefly mention about mind mapping, there's this book by Buzan, the Mind Map book. He writes about mind mapping as a very powerful way to capture really a theory of what leads to what leads to what. People often use mind mapping to take notes or to brainstorm ideas. And so ripple effects mapping is basically using mind mapping as part of a retrospective evaluation of a program with a group of people. So here's the major steps. First, you identify the intervention. Then you schedule your 2-hour event and you recruit and invite participants. Then you hold your session. It's a bit like wedding planning. Getting to that point, you have to think about all the logistics. You need food, you need a good location, you don't need a band. But it is important to think about getting also the recruitment done well. You often have to do some follow-up interviews because there's key people who might not have been able to make it to the session, and there also are key people who did make it that you want to get more information from afterwards. And then finally, there's a process of cleaning and coding your data and figuring out how to report it so that people can actually use it. So I'm going to briefly touch on each of these steps, but obviously we're limited with time today. And so you can go to that field guide to learn more about all of this. When I talk about identifying the intervention, it's usually a very high engagement program, or sometimes it's actually a role or position. For example, the traditional extension county agent role is one that really builds a lot of social capital, and throughout the history of extension, there have not been a lot of evaluations to really document the ripple effects of a local extension agent role. But I think that would be interesting. Usually when I do this, it's focused on a program that engages a community over a long period of time, or it could be engages a sector over a long period of time. Sometimes it's a cross-sector initiative or a collaboration. The other important thing is this is a participatory method. It's not just up to the evaluator to identify the intervention. There should be a process of engagement with the folks who are either the end users or the participants in the program to really think about how you're going to label the intervention and who you're going to recruit to come to this session. So you want to really be thinking with people about what it is you're evaluating. My best example is the Master Gardeners here in Minnesota wanted to evaluate their work in 2 neighborhoods in St. Paul, but when they sat down with members of the community, the members of the community said, well, we're not just interested in what the Master Gardeners have done. We're interested in the broader community gardening efforts in our neighborhoods. So they broadened the scope of what was being evaluated. So then you talk about who do you invite? And what's cool about ripple mapping is you're thinking about people who are really close into an intervention or a program, like program participants. We do this a lot for leadership programs. So you invite some, but not all of the participants. You think about the ones who are verbal and critical thinkers. They don't have to be, all, gung-ho about the program, but they need to be thoughtful and the kind of people who would really add value in a group situation. Then you invite an equal number of people who are further out from the intervention or program. I call them non-participant stakeholders. They might not be directly involved in the program, but they might be very active in other ways in the community, or they may know people who went through the program or who were participants in the program. They do have to know a little bit about the program or intervention, but they don't have to be core participants. When you get those 2 groups together and they interview each other, that leads not only to great insights, but it also helps people connect the dots between something a participant thought might have happened with something a non-participant saw happening in the broader community. And sometimes they're able to connect those chains of effects together. You're shooting for 12 to 20 participants at the session. If you go much bigger, not everyone gets to be heard. If you go much smaller, you don't really have enough information. So you try to have that many people roughly divided between those 2 groups, participants and non-participants. And you need to have 2 moderators, one who's an overall facilitator of the session and one who's actually capturing the data, typing madly onto a mind map. Those moderators should not be the people who run the program. The people who run the program can be participants in the session, but they should not lead the evaluation of it. So I mentioned this appreciative inquiry interview. You pair people up. Ideally, you're pairing a non-participant with a participant, or someone close into the program with someone a little further out. And they ask each other questions like this. What is a highlight achievement or success you had from participating? What new or deepened connections with others did you make, and what did those connections lead to? Or what unexpected things happened as a result of your participation? You may need to word these questions a little differently for the non-participants, which is not terribly hard to do. I always give people an agenda, and on the back of the agenda are the questions where they will write their answers when they interview each other. Once everyone has interviewed each other, I usually, by the way, give them about 7 or 8 minutes to interview each other, and then I use my phone as a timer and tell them to switch. And so they've each interviewed each other, and then you have people sit in a half circle in front of a screen where you're shining this blank mind map, and I'm going to show you a little bit about what that looks like in a minute. You go around the circle and have people report out not everything from their interview, but 2 or 3 things that they heard that particularly stood out to them as the listener. And so everyone gets to report out things they heard, and that gets captured by a typist using mind mapping software. The rest of the material on the sheets is collected at the end of the session and added to the mind map after the session is done. I'm going to show you what these mind maps look like in a few seconds here. But first, I want to tell you that once you have all the loose data, unorganized data on this blank mind map, you give people perhaps a little bit of a break for 5 minutes, and the two facilitators start to talk with each other about possible ways to group or categorize data. I call that theming. This is basically an element of qualitative data analysis that you are doing on the fly in front of a group of 20 people. But the thing is, the people in the room are more than willing to help you. So you just throw out some ideas for themes, and then typically people will chime in and say whether they agree or disagree with those themes, or whether there are other themes that they think are important. And you start to organize the data around those themes. And then rippling is a separate discussion where you go into depth about particular stories or particular chains of things that happened. So in other words, what led to what led to what. And the mind mapping software allows you to show that really nicely. So here, it's probably hard to see on your screen, but this is what a mind map looks like about halfway through the 2-hour session, where the cells, I guess, they're called floating topics, these little cells that have text in them. But when you start to generate the themes, which are connected to the middle here, you can start dragging the different floating topics and connecting them to the theme that is relevant. And you start to do this during the session. And what I mean by ripple chains are the sort of themes and the sub-themes and the sub-themes after that you can see flowing out radially from the center. This, by the way, was a water quality effort in Minnesota. We have civic engagement cohort programs for water quality professionals. And so this was a ripple mapping of one of those programs, which we just did last month. This was a more final ripple map from one of those water quality cohorts a few years back. And again, it's hard to see, but the core themes that came out of that session were mobilized events that engaged citizens in water quality, strengthened knowledge and skills for engaging the public, connecting people in regions and in the state, integrating civic engagement in water quality work, and then a whole bunch of stuff in the upper right, which we called concerns. As I mentioned, you don't want all the conversation to be positive. So towards the end of the session, you have what I call the negatives conversation, where you ask people to think about things that have not gone so well or things that will be challenges moving forward, and you add all that stuff to the ripple map. Once you get your ripple map kind of drafted and organized, you send it back to the core participants. They might have edits and they might have suggestions to strengthen it. And then once you're done with this mind map, you can actually copy and paste the data into Excel and code the data. And we like to use something called the Community Capitals Framework, which is shown here, as a way to code the information. So this is something we use a lot in community development work and extension. And it might not be the relevant framework for you, but you might go back to whatever theory of change your program has, and that theory of change might have a good framework for you to use for coding your data. And then if you do that, you can have something like this in Excel, where you put your coding categories in there as columns, and you go through everything that came out of the ripple mapping discussion, and with a partner, again, I recommend doing this in pairs, go through and figure out which which effects that people reported are you going to count as each kind of in each kind of category or code. And then you can add things up and report the data in a table like this, where you can give, so human capital effects, 25 of the effects that were reported were human capital effects. Out of 41 total effects was 61%. And then you can give examples. And it gives your audience a little bit of numbers to hold on to and a sense of proportion about what are the biggest areas in which this program had an impact. This is particularly interesting when you're doing ripple mapping for the same kind of program again and again in different locations. So this was a what's called business retention program, which we do in different communities. In this community, only 29% of the effects were really social capital effects, which was really, really low compared to other communities that have gone through this program. And so that created a very good dialogue with our staff about what didn't go well in that program that we want to make sure we don't do wrong again. You want to think about creative ways to report the information. This is a nice idea to take the core themes and do a graphic where you can have a little bit of text related to each of those core themes and maybe some images, but as a way to quickly communicate what your key insights were from the ripple mapping. A little bit about the skill set needed to do this. Whoever's facilitating would need to have some good group process facilitation skills. One of the things you have to be able to do is manage to make sure everyone's voice is getting heard and that no one is dominating the session. If you're going to live capture, typing the data into a mind mapping, you have to have pretty good interviewing skills and some comfort with generating categories or themes on the fly. And actually, the bigger issue is you have to be comfortable with not getting it perfect, and that people in the room will have a lot of wisdom to share. And that also goes along with this commitment to participatory evaluation, that a commitment to not seeing your role as the expert outside evaluator, but as someone who's there to engage the wisdom of the group in thinking about the impacts of a program. Some of the benefits are that it's relatively simple, that software is free. The biggest challenge is recruiting and getting a good bunch of people into the room on the day that you're doing the session. I always feed people. You may need to provide childcare in some situations, but you have to think through all that stuff. It does allow you to capture the impacts of complex work, as well, like those unintended impacts that I mentioned earlier. It very much engages participants, and sometimes it leads to further collaborative action. Just having the session can often spark more work and better work and more connections among people who need to be connected. And this idea of group validation is great. People can disagree with each other about who gets the credit for a particular change, and you can document all the different players on a ripple map so that not one organization is getting all the credit. And people can really have that dialogue during a session. And I want to mention that that attribution question is important. I think that this might come up on the next slide, but it's important to talk about who gets the credit, and if extension's involved, how much credit does the extension program get versus other efforts that may have already been underway. Okay, I'm getting the hook to try to finish up. Some limitations here are listed. There's a risk of bias. You're not using random sampling to get people to participate. You are actually using a more qualitative tradition of getting the most informed people to come and be part of the conversation. This issue of attribution versus contribution, I'd be happy to talk about it more when we have chat, but it is important to address that with people and make sure that they're not overly giving credit to extension, for example, when there's other things going on in the community that may have played a role. It's important to probe for those negative results, and it's important to use external staff, as I mentioned, to do the facilitation. So with that, I will end my presentation and go now to, we can go now to the Q&A and discussion.
Great, thank you, Scott. And you ended just in time for the train to be going by here in Madison. So, and love that you have these prompting discussion questions there. I'll first ask for folks in the audience if they have any questions for either of our presenters, either Amber May or Scott Chasden. And again, you can go ahead and put those in the chat box there at the lower right. And while we're waiting for any questions, Amber, I wonder if you might tell us briefly how you chose the method. So you really focused on this particular case of the manure runoff risk advisory tool and what you did in evaluation. But could you tell us a little bit more about why you chose the mix of methods that you did?
Sure. So yeah, I didn't have time to talk about one piece, but the kind of one of the very first things we did was kind of some usability testing using a website called usertesting.com. And that was just sort of to refine the tool. They kind of knew that it could stand to be kind of cleaned up maybe, or improved just in terms of usability. And then we knew we had connections with that PNA, professional nutrient applicator training, and we knew that there would be that DATCAP would be giving a presentation to a larger group, and we wanted to get some feedback from that larger group quickly and easily. So that was how we sort of landed on a short one-page survey that we could give to everyone. But we also, as I talked to the team, it became apparent that maybe some more qualitative feedback and in-depth discussion with some key users would be very helpful as they sort of transitioned from the older version to the new version, as well as sort of just like documenting how are people using this tool, because they'd kind of been running with it for a while, but hadn't really had social science incorporated up to that point. Oh, and then, so yes, yeah, it was kind of a combination of, yeah, what would be most useful at this time, and opportunistic, since it was, we did have a relatively small pot of money. So yeah, just kind of using connections. Also in the case of the Manure Expo, because we already had that connection with Kevin Erb and our unit evaluating the Manure Expo overall. So just sort of capitalizing on that to say, hey, could we ask some questions of Wisconsin folks about this tool?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. Sure. And Scott, I had a question for you. How, and I may know the answer to this question, but I'm not sure. So I wondered about how ripple effects mapping gets at some of the evaluation challenges associated with self-reporting. And I know you use non-participants, but do you specifically think about challenges with self-reporting when you pick the non-participants, or how do you address that?
Well, in terms of people reporting things that they did that are not accurate, is that what you're
or
saying?
perceptions that may not be accurate. Yep.
What's interesting
not so much what they did, but perceptions of the impacts that may not be accurate.
Right. Well, that's where it is helpful to have it's nice to have those non-participant stakeholders, but even among people who are core participants, people tend not to overstate their impacts. In Minnesota, we like to say that people are all like incredibly sheepish around giving themselves credit for things happening that they didn't do. I think it's the opposite problem, is that people tend to not even think about actions the impacts of actions they took. But I do think if there is a risk of someone making an attribution, um, sometimes that is fixed by other members of the group actually saying, well, actually, this other organization played a really big role as well. And there's nothing to say that you can't, once you've got your ripple map, go kind of have it vetted with some other people who are perhaps in a position to say, well, I don't really think this happened as a result of that person's actions. So I guess it's nice to have that range of people involved in the effort, so whatever people say can be validated.
Great, thanks, Scott. And do you have any other advice for folks about when to use ripple effects mapping over some other, participatory evaluation methods? You talked about that a little bit, but I'm just looking at our audience here and the type of folks that we have, and thinking, for educators, any other advice about when you pick ripple effects mapping over other kinds of participatory evaluation tools?
Well, I guess I always, is it the kind of intervention where you sometimes you've actually heard someone talk about ripple effects, or you've heard people say, oh, well, the program led to this thing happening in the community or in the watershed. So if you've started to hear about the program being a catalyst of other things happening, that's a situation where you probably want to use ripple mapping. I mean, you certainly could use other methods that are less participatory. And what happens if you use other methods that are less participatory is that your evaluation is not as likely to actually contribute to the furthering of that collaborative activity. Evaluation can add, participatory evaluation can add to the value of the actual work. And so when you talk about other participatory methods, I don't know, there aren't that many others that I'm thinking of. There's participatory action research, and this is almost a variant of that in some ways. It's like a participatory action evaluation in some sense. But most evaluation is not participatory. It's very much asking people questions and having them answer them.
Thank you. And then finally, yeah, you're getting at some in your final question here is, what concerns do you have about this method? Anything that you might say about concerns that you've heard people express, or issues that you've heard in the evaluation community about participatory method. Just anything that you'd like to say about, what did you call it? The concern side, that you've noticed, just to share that with our folks on the line, and how you might respond to some of those concerns.
Right. I mean, this is why I stress that this should not be the only evaluation method used, because it's very much from the qualitative tradition, and it's very much built around appreciative inquiry. So if you have a stakeholder or a funder who is looking for evidence-based practice, or who is not comfortable with a more qualitative approach, you could potentially combine this with other approaches that are surveys that might use a more random strategy for selecting who's surveyed. I guess it really depends on who the stakeholders are, and that are going to use the evaluation. In my experience, I have to say, funders have often loved this kind of information. I think a lot of funders really like stories in general, And this is kind of a very good way to surface stories about impact that are incredibly helpful in communicating with stakeholders such as funders. But they also do need some numbers often, and that's why you want to have some other methods to document impacts, or especially outcomes, behavior change outcomes or knowledge change outcomes among your participants. But if you think about extension, we rarely do evaluation that gets at this level of condition change, and often it's way too expensive to do. And this is one method to get at some of the condition change that is not expensive.
Yep. Great point. Okay. Okay, folks, this is your last chance to ask any questions in the chat box, and I'm going to slowly move us on here to Scott's thank you slide. And you do have the link to the field guide there that Janice posted in the chat box should you want more detailed information. Of course, here's Scott's contact information. And here is also Scott's contact information, as well as Amber Mace's email. So you please, one of the reasons we do this is to provide you with a way to get to know some of the experts in the field that you may not have known before this. And so we want to share the people part with you, as well as the types of programming that they're working on. And then finally, we want to thank you for joining us today and remind you that this session will be posted at northcentralwater.org and learn.eextension.org if you know folks that might be interested in the content that weren't able to make it today. And then our next webinar is on water use efficiency, and that will be April 11th, same time, 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern. So thanks so much for joining us, everyone, and thanks again to our presenters, Scott and Amber, and have a great rest of the afternoon.